Okay, so this is for my wonderful friend who we lost a few years ago, Jack Guastamacchia. He and I talked about this down at the train station in Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, after we saw a show at the Mock Junk Opera House that night. Darn if I can remember. It was because we saw a ton of shows. He had said to me, and now I'm going to ask you, David. Well, didn't ask me this, he stated to me classic rock music has now become classical music. What he means is when he's older than me, he'd be 70 years old if he was alive today. I'm 55. Remember, we were growing up when we were learning music. All we were learning through kindergarten through sixth grade, through eighth grade, a little bit in high school. If we had a music class, we were talking about Bach and Mozart, Beethoven, and all these great composers made fantastic music. These days, the kids today, are they still listening to that? Are they learning that? I go, I don't think so. He goes, well, if you get right down to it, classic rock has become what classical music was to us. And not so much classic rock. I mean, the Beatles would be considered classical music now. The Rolling Stones would be considered classical music because, in his theory, that music is considered timeless. And the best of the music that came from like the 60s and 70s, maybe a little bit the 80s, has become what we would call, what the next generation will call classical music. Would you agree with that statement that bands like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Who, Led Zeppelin, Rush have become what classical music was for generations before?
I can agree to it to the extent that okay, so it's not a statement that I would particularly say myself initially. But I can understand what he's saying, and I'll try to see if I'll try to see what pushback I even have towards this. So, if he's saying that the well that um a well must exist for artists to get inspired from, there's a well of music or art that influences them. Okay. So the influential well that came from, the baby boomers era, which get talked about all the time because there's such a massive amount of people born and such a massive amount of influence, because it's compounded with the technological advancements. Everybody has access to this now. It's being pushed on everyone, through media, television, video, eventually music video in the 80s. So it's getting this Goliath level of reach. It's not surprising to me that you're going again. We talk about sunlight getting on the trees. It's not surprising to me that the exposure, um, the massive exposure, the unprecedented amount of exposure that music that came out during that period of time, is going to eclipse what came before it. I think it's not because the quality is better or worse. Um, I think that his statement has validity because It's just the amount of it was it was there for people to fall in love with on a mass scale. Um, it could have been anything else that was great music. It had to be great. I'm not saying that it's going to even get to the cream's not going to rise to the crop unless it has that merit, right? But I think that it's definitely palpable that it's a lot hipper to be in high school and you want to start a band and stuff and you want what got you there. The probability is we're we're sort of captured already by was when I was growing up, like MTV, and or captured by watching Midnight Special or just what's on the radio decades before I was born. Like you're already captured by that. That's already got in the same way that like Renaissance painters and artists who made beautiful like masterpieces on canvas and such. Um, I'm not looking at that. I'm looking at Batman. Batman and Ninja Turtles is what that is for me and my generation. Um, is you know, it's not because it's not, again, it's not a quality thing, but it's just because that's what's we're captured by that. So like we're just when you can't escape um the power of influence and the amount of influence that the mass appeal has. If those big wheels are turning and those machines are pushing out um, to make sure that that movie is in X amount of theaters this weekend, and you're going to watch X amount of commercials pop up for this movie. Like every time there's a commercial break when you're watching your TV show, this song is being played X amount of times every like 10 minutes on some station in the country. That has an effect. It has a great effect. You cannot negate that. And that's the rise of the big wheels in a sense, the big machine taking over. So yeah, those big machines happened, and of course it eclipsed like of course it captured the attention of the youth and in perpetuity. Something else can come along that can decentralize. And my hope is to always have more decentralization because it just means that there's more choices for the individual to do what they want or listen to what they want or anything. Like, so um, you're growing up at a time when there's a grand centralization of certain artists and certain TV shows and stuff and movies and everything like that. So a great centralization of art. And of course, it's going to be the new classical music in that sense. I mean, look, what he's pointing at, like I see what he's pointing at. You know what I mean? I'm not negating that it exists. You agree with him 100%?
At first, I didn't agree with him much at all.
Oh yeah.
At first, then when we started discussing it, I saw where he was going. I don't remember everything, every little thing that we talked about, but things that I was thinking about was okay, we were learning about classical composers when we were in middle school, particular middle school music class. That's what we learned about. Right around the time I was in middle school, they put out the movie Amadeus,
Hmm.
which was very popular. And the next year, Falco put out a song called Rock Me Amadeus, and it was a pure pop song.
Yeah.
And there was more attention being brought to Mozart's music. Yeah. I'm not saying Mozart was getting played on KRZFM or Rock 107 or anything like that, but a lot of people loved Amadeus, as did I. I still have a VHS tape of Amadeus. And I, for several years, took classical piano lessons. If you think about now, we're kind of doing it. We celebrated Mozart in 84. And in recent years, let's say the last 10 years or so, we celebrate Queen with Bohemian Rhapsody.
Yeah.
We celebrate Elton John with Rocket Man. And there have been a few others. They just different kind of music, but they just did one on Michael Jackson. And Jermaine
Yeah.
Jackson's son plays Michael, and that was very well done. It set itself up for a sequel too, in my opinion. But we've there have been other artists, other bands they've done it for, but those are the ones that jump out at me right now. So I think when we're putting out those kind of movies and the ones that have the Elton John and the Queen ones, I thought they they kind of play like a musical at times, which I wasn't a fan of, but I know that a lot of people love that. And maybe it wasn't completely accurate chronologically. As a music nerd, I picked up on that stuff. But I found
Yeah.
it to be entertaining, and I thought it really spiked music, an interest in Queen's music in particular. Now you see teenagers wearing Queen shirts, which is really, really cool. And
Yeah.
you go to your Spencer's or your Hot Topic, you're gonna see t-shirts of Queen and a lot of other bands now that were part of our foundation. So the more he and I talked about it, the more I agree with him. But at first I thought he was crazy. But another thing that I think about, you don't hear as much of that music on classic rock radio anymore because then you got to get into 90s music now. Now you got to get into 2000s music. Now you got to get into 80s music. Us people in the 80s, we want to hear Rat, we want to hear Motley Crue, we want to hear Poison. This is what we grew up with. Maybe we're not listening to it so much now, but we
Yeah.
hear that. We get all nostalgic, right? So you're not hearing as much because their playlists can only be so long. You're not hearing as much Led Zeppelin. You're very rarely hearing the Beatles. You used to hear the Beatles a lot more on classic rock, not so much now. You're not hearing as much Rolling Stones because you got to get other stuff in. So, but they were all those bands were like the Beatles, Stones, Who, etc., Led Zeppelin, very important culturally to our fabric. And we gotta we have to know about them. So the next generation's gotta know about this great music. I think there's gonna be, and the fact that you could still hear some of this music on the radio, I think is more important too. They're gonna be more interested in that. Whereas when I was younger and outside of Mozart, I mean, they didn't have popular music movies about Haydn and the other classical composers or George Gershwin, guys like that. But it was interesting, but some of us were like, oh God, let's just get through this, whatever. But I think the fact that you still hear these musicians on the radio these days, some of them are still touring, put out new albums, Rolling Stones. I think that keeps like the younger people more interested in it. The fact that we have movies coming out. We have documentaries like Bob Dylan, No Direction Home, and the Bob Dylan one that came out last year. I forgot about that one when it focused on his folk years. I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but I went to see it and it was excellent. So I'm thinking in that way, culturally, it's becoming more the classical of the next generation. So while at first I thought he was off, made more sense to me as we talked it out. And then I thought about it more as time went on.
Why did you think, what was your initial reason for thinking it was off? Is it because
The
you
thought never entered
interpreted
my brain.
No, but did you think that he was interpreting, like, did you think that his statement was comparing it stylistically
No,
instead of, because he's comparing it in spirit? It's the classical music of now. It's the domineering main well, like I was saying, the analogy of the well. Um, so you just you just didn't initially agree with it because you didn't no dots connected at first. You didn't think it was like them saying that it's like a downgrade because like classical music is very sophisticated and it's like um it's well let's although I love and spend so much more time with like the Beatles and some of those bands you talk about Zeppelin and stuff like that, and I don't listen to classical music as much, hardly. When I do listen to it, I do realize that this is beyond three-dimensional music. It's like the Beatles is three-dimensional music. You could say it's four-dimensional music. Classical music is like five or six or seven-dimensional music. The only reason why I'm saying this is not because of quality. Again, I'm a thousand times more listening to Sergeant Pepper's and Abbey Road and Let It Be than I'm listening to uh, Mozart, right? However, I still can observe that that music cuts through to anybody. They don't even have to speak English. It's doing something different. It's it's designed from a time period where the intentions, I think, were beyond what we usually start with now when we think about a song or we write a song. Um, or John Lennon or McCartney talk about like them writing a song and seeing like the impetus of it and it just seems like classical music was meant for completely different reasons. There's a completely different like thing going on there. Um, so I recognize that, and that's like very important. Whereas no matter how big anybody that played Woodstock was, it's still going to alienate or it's not going to reach as wide of a demo have the probability to watch reach as wide of a demographic. No, I mean you can challenge what I just said and you can say, hey, David, how many Mozart albums did they sell last year? How many people are you driving by in their car and you're listening to Mozart as opposed to um, how many times you're going to hear all along the Watchtower or Who Are You or something like that. And I'm going to say I hear The Who and Jimi Hendrix a lot more, but I still think that I can't play Jimi Hendrix to my grandparents or great grandparents because it's gonna be off. And I might not be able to play classical music to like um my 2-year-old niece, like or maybe she's 5 or something. Maybe she'll get into it, maybe she won't. But it stood the test of time. I would have to wait to see if music like that is going to stand the test of time in a few hundred years to where it's going to be able to be important. Whereas schools were teaching it hundreds of years after it was originally like written. Will that still happen like 500 years from now with the Beatles? Like I don't know. Um, but I know there's some, it's like when I was a kid, it's like you listen to classical music, it's like, oh, this is boring and it's too sophisticated and it's complex. Like, I want to hear something more immediate and simple. But I still at the same time recognize it's like this is going over my head. It's not because it's not really boring, it's going over my head. I know that there's something important there. I'm just not able to like I don't have access to it yet. Something that I can't sense a proper acknowledgement for it yet. But I imagine when I get older and I'm more mature, like I probably will, you know. Um, so yeah, I mean, classical music was in its time something else. Like the comparison to like classic rock to classical music. Classic rock is the new classical music. Well, classical music was probably the new whatever, I don't know. Um, Something that I imagine would have been like considered ethereal or people, sort of like gathering together to chant or have like religious experiences or like spiritual experiences, I imagine like existed before classical music. And that was like really important and passed down. And unfortunately, I'm too ignorant on the subject to start bringing up like proper topics and name drop here. But like I imagine, I know that classical music wasn't the beginning of music. Um, yeah, does that answer?
Yes, definitely. Absolutely. Another thing I thought about after Jack and I had that conversation, where I thought he had a very good point, was we had a local philharmonic, the Northeast Pennsylvania Philharmonic. And I went through a phase in the early 2010s where I was going to a lot of those performances. As time went on, the attendances got smaller at those performances. So what they started to do is they started to do something more modern. They
Mhm.
do the Beatles music one night as classically done. And they would do more plays and things from the 60s, like Sound of Music, things like that. To the point where those shows were doing better than the nights that were dedicated to classical music. And sadly, as time went on, we didn't have a philharmonic because there wasn't enough interest here in our area. But for a long time, they would do 4 performances at the Kirby Center every year, 4 performances at the Scranton Cultural Center. And they would do those 4 shows would be one they do in Wilkes-Barre, one they would do in Scranton. And before that, before I was getting into classical music, they had more performances than that, but they weren't doing modern classic nights then. Then they were sticking with just classical. And then as time went on, they started doing stuff that was more modern, and then eventually it stopped. So when I thought about what happened with our Philharmonic over time, then I thought about what Jack said. So that was kind of dying off. But what was keeping it going for a little while was they were doing stuff like the Beatles, and it was doing well. A younger audience was coming in. When I would go see the classical performances, like Rock 3 by Rachmaninoff, there was some of us were a little younger, but it was mostly people who were retired. And I think what happened was that audience wasn't there anymore. But, classic rock got very popular in the 1980s when they introduced that format. And as time went on, it was, oh, my father listened to the Stones. My father listened to this music. Like the next generations were saying, oh, my father listened to Queen. My mother listened to the Beatles. My uncle listened to Led Zeppelin, et cetera, et cetera. So we were thinking that more, okay, it's older. That's the classic music now for the classical music now for the newer generations. So when he said that, I was like, what do you mean? Because the thought never entered my head. And then he explained it, meant a little more, but through the Amadeus movie, I thought about, and then the what was happening with our Philharmonic. Because when I met Jack, that was after I went to see the Philharmonic. By that point, I was going back, listening to more rock music and um, going out to see a lot of shows again. That was that then between all those things, then it made more sense. So like, I was like, yeah, he was spot on. At first, I was like, where you going with this? So there you have it. Everyone out there, is classic rock music the new classical music? What do your children listen to these days? Do they have music classes in school these days where they're talking about music from the past anymore? What do you think about that statement? That, like David and I were saying, in a few hundred years, are they still going to be playing the Beatles? Or are schools going to be talking about the importance of the Beatles music, the Rolling Stones music, the Grateful Dead's music, Led Zeppelin's music? Are they going to talk about the Who's Tommy? Are they going to talk about Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon? Please let us know in the comments what you think, and thank you so much for watching.
Thank you.